So that's the right place to start. That's the most fundamental question. I think the answer begins with the observation that it's difficult to establish perfect values for any currency, not just the renminbi. This is a global phenomenon that has been one of the most contentious issues in policy economics since the end of World War II. And then after the end of the gold standard, it got more acute. So the past 30 years, we've had tremendous debate over the appropriate value of the pound, of the yen, more recently of the euro, all against the dollar. So it's really no surprise that the renminbi, at a moment when China has become one of the leading economies in the world, second biggest economy on the planet, the currency of China is going to be a matter of considerable debate as well. So China is the first point to make, is that China is not unique in this regard. Very few countries have a freely floating currency today. There are many forces at work in the international economy that tend to buffer around the value of a currency. The daily value of speculative financial transactions is much, much greater nowadays than the value of a use of currency for trade purposes. And so countries have a legitimate reason to not want to leave their currencies just entirely to the vagaries of the marketplace, but instead to use any number of different approaches to managing their value. And then finally, in the case of China, I would say it's particularly difficult because whatever we think is the right way to gauge an exchange rate between two mature economies, say between Japan and the United States, or the United States and the European Union, China is and has been going through an extraordinary multi-decade process of economic reform and adjustment. It is the quintessential transition economy. And so whatever one could say about the value of the renminbi in any given month or moment is probably going to be different in the year to follow, given the enormous extent of policy change taking place for China. Many economies, including advanced ones, are reluctant to simply embrace free floating. Hong Kong does not, Chile does not, Japan does not. In Europe, there's quite a bit of attention given to the value of the currency as well. So China's not unique in this regard, and especially at a time when when China is moving toward having a more international role for its currency. The risk of instability at this time is particularly pronounced, particularly great for China. So on the one hand, I would point out that China is taking really significant steps toward having a more market-determined exchange rate. So while it's not embracing a free float at this moment, it is embracing the principle of allowing the market to develop the value of its currency to a just tremendously much greater extent than it did even in the fairly recent past. So it's kind of already turned the corner to a great extent. What conditions would be required for China to finish that process? Well, I think the first thing to point out is that it's already trying to move the next several steps in the process. And the reason for that, the condition that is causing Beijing to want to have a more international currency, is that if China wants to play a more active role geoeconomically, have more to say at the IMF, have its currency, not just the dollar, be the benchmark of international financial transactions and activity, it has to evolve beyond tightly controlling the value of the currency, not letting it be used in international transactions, to having a currency which is strong, independent enough that it doesn't require constant political interference to maintain its value and stability. So not only is a more freely floating renminbi an economic goal for China, it's a political goal as well, and one it's made known it's quite committed to. In decades past, the value of the currency, China's currency, and moreover, its stability and predictability were essential to the competitiveness of low value added Chinese light manufactured goods, which is really all that China had to offer the world economy, but was, predominant in consumer electronics and apparel and these sorts of things, where there's really not very much value added involved, labor intensive, simple goods to produce. Other costs of production are not really a very big deal for those kinds of products, but stability in exchange rates could be very important. So in the past, the value of the renminbi and its predictability was essential to the Chinese economic model. Today, over the past year, China's leaders have almost to a person repeated the mantra that China has no intention of making its currency policy on the basis of what would promote Chinese exports or improve Chinese export competitiveness. And I think they're being sincere when they say that. The fact is that other costs of production in China are changing much more rapidly than the value of the renminbi has been swinging lately, and are much more fundamental to whether China's products are going to be competitive in international markets. I'll mention a few. For example, labor costs have reached the point at which they've been rising rapidly. Skill level, especially critical here, for more skilled, higher value-added labor inputs. Prices for employment are rising very rapidly in China. Environmental compliance costs, resource costs for inputs, financial costs, cost of borrowing in China. All these things are I dare say, more important for China's overall export competitiveness than the renminbi is at this juncture. So while surprising and very volatile swings in any currency, and especially the renminbi, would be terrible for China's competitiveness, having it be 2, 5, or even 10, or even 15% devalued against the US dollar isn't going to do very much for China right now. Finally, we have to keep in mind that an exchange rate is not in a vacuum between two economies. It's a global number. If China were to permit the renminbi to devalue significantly at this point, one can be reasonably sure that 1, 2, or 3 dozen other peer competitors of China, such as Indonesia, Brazil, and Mexico, other manufacturers of light manufactured goods, could very well follow suit and also devalue, leaving China right back where it started, except in a less desirable position, because the credibility of its central bank to back up its no devaluation pledges will have been squandered. The most challenging element of rebalancing for China is permitting the domestic Chinese financial system to function more productively, more efficiently, and independently, which means that domestic banks and other sources of credit are going to have to make their own more market-oriented decisions about who gets to borrow. Part of this rebalancing process for China necessarily means opening the Chinese economy to international financial services rather than keeping the Chinese economy closed to global financial services, as is the case until today. With a more porous capital account border for China, Chinese people are going to be able to send their wealth and their savings out of the country in a pursuit of a better return on investment. These fundamental changes to China's financial system make it increasingly impossible to try to maintain a tightly controlled renminbi exchange rate. Every day now we have billions and billions and billions of cross-border financial flows in and out of China, not just for goods and services anymore, but with outbound direct investment, Chinese companies going abroad. The whole context in which it was even practical to consider keeping the exchange rate fixed in the way it was in the past has changed, and China's moved on. If China wants to have a dynamic domestic financial system, it has to move forward toward having a more market-oriented exchange rate regime as well. Very long books have been written on the question of what have been the consequences of China's exchange rate system in the past, what are they in the present, and what could they be in the future. I'll offer just a very simple response to that. I think over the first several decades of China's reform and opening up period after 1978, the relative stability of China's exchange rate policy was beneficial for growth and globalization, as firms from around the world saw that it was predictable enough in terms of exchange rates to put significant operations in China and operate there after 1978 right through the present. So it was confidence inducing. That was tested in the 1990s when, during the Asian financial crisis, China chose not to pursue a course of devaluation with its currency at the same time that many other countries in the region were doing so. So China put credibility in the bank, so to speak, and built up quite a bit of goodwill and respect from other central banks around the world and from financial institutions and firms alike. That was the greatest consequence of China's policy in the past. In the present, on the one hand, we can take China's intentions to marketize, to reform its economy seriously, because it's taken several very important steps to liberalize its exchange rate system. After the mid-2000s, China responded to its very large current account surpluses, external imbalances, by permitting the renminbi to strengthen very significantly against the dollar. Over the past several years, important steps have been taken to move further toward market determination of exchange rates. The problem is that the challenges which, not surprisingly, have come up during that partial transition have led to as many questions about China's credibility going forward as they've answered. The People's Bank started to allow the market to direct the daily setting price for the renminbi, and then pulled back on that, and over the past 6 months has in fact been preventing the currency from depreciating, both for geoeconomic reasons and because the Chinese central bank is concerned that if an assumption of persistent exchange rate devaluation sinks in China, many Chinese will start to try to get assets out of the country, leading to capital flight. So there's a bit of the consequence of the partial reform we're going through presently is that a lot of the credibility China built up over decades in the past is now in doubt, and the burden is back on Beijing to demonstrate its commitment and seriousness and willingness to tolerate a lot of pain and volatility in the course of moving to a new regime for the renminbi.